Hi everyone, it's Dr. Hall, and we're going to get started with lecture 12, which is on the somatosensory system. Here's our outline for lecture 12. We're going to talk about some general concepts that are true for the entire somatosensory system. Then we're going to talk specifically about the different types of touch we can perceive, which is done by some mechanoreceptors found in the skin. Then we're going to talk about pain and temperature, some additional pain-associated phenomena that are of interest, and then proprioception. So we'll get started with 12A, which is these general concepts that will apply to everything that we're talking about in this lecture. So first of all, let's be clear what we're talking about. So somatosensory, soma, the word means of the body. So remember, in the neuron, the cell body is called the soma. When we talk about the soma for people, in general, it's the muscles, the bones, and the skin. It's kind of the meat skeleton in which your squishy bits are housed. It's everything that kind of isn't an inner organ is generally what we're talking about when we talk about somatic senses, as opposed to visceral senses, which we'll get into a little bit in this lecture. Then, of course, sensory is our afferent or afferent signals coming from the body into the central nervous system for perception and processing and potential responses. So in this diagram here, you have a nerve ending, or a sensory neuron ending is a little bit more appropriate. So their use of the term nerve here is a little problematic. And we're sending a signal into the central nervous system. And you probably remember from our unit on the spinal cord that the soma of the sensory neuron is located in that dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord. So you probably also remember that sensory neurons are strange in terms of how they are shaped. Now, depending on whether you're looking at the Limb textbook or the Hedges textbook, it might be classified as pseudo-unipolar or bipolar. What I want you to know is that they're kind of weird, and because the cell body is located here, and here is the axon, right? This whole thing here. And so the cell body is kind of situated in the middle of the axon, and you have a receptor out here, which is going to be perceiving something, and then it's going to send signal along that axon into the spinal cord. So for all of our sensory neurons, the cell bodies are going to live in the ganglia. For the general body, it's going to be the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord. But remember, cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, is for sensation of the face. And so you have a special trigeminal ganglion up near the brainstem for cranial nerve 5. Then, of course, I've used the term proximal projection. So if you're farther away, this is the distal part of the sensory neuron. This part over here, closer into the central nervous system, is the proximal part that is sending the signal into the central nervous system. Okay, so sensory neurons are weird in terms of their physical structure. Remember also when we talked about the spinal cord, we talked about dermatomes. So our body sensation, depending on what part of the body it is going to, those nerve fibers, those axons, are going to enter the spinal cord at specific levels. So I know, for example, that sensation from the belly button is going to come into the spinal cord at around T10. So I know that that's where those sensory axons are going to travel. So it's all organized according to body parts, which is kind of cool. I also want to point out, and this is also a reminder from way back in the beginning of the course, that axon diameter and degree of myelin can vary. And you may remember that the bigger the diameter and the more myelin you have, the more quickly you can send an action potential down that axon. The smaller the diameter, the less myelin, the more slowly those signals will travel. So we have different types of sensory neurons for different types of sensations, and they're going to have different types of axons. So as we go through this unit, as we go through this lecture, you'll see that some have one type of axon, some have another type of axon, and that will be relevant when we talk about some things. So different types of axons for different types of sensory neurons, and therefore different types of sensations. So I'm going to give you a little, sorry, I have a cat on my lap, a little taste here. So these are A beta, and touch is going to come through A beta axons. And then we have both A delta and C, and pain and temperature are going to travel on those, but they are slower. And then this one here, group 1, is sometimes also called A alpha, and that's for proprioception. So we're going to see different senses have different speeds of transmission because they have different diameters and degree of myelinization of their axons. The other thing that I want to point out is that for all of these, it's 3 steps to get to the cortex. So remember in vision, we had our first synapse of the axons that came through the optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. Their first synapse was in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then it projected back in the radiations to the occipital cortex, to the primary visual area. But for hearing, we had all these stops and all of these synapses, and we were decussating and crossing from one side to the other. So it was very different from one system to another before then ending up at the thalamus and then going to the primary auditory area in the temporal cortex. So for all of somatosensory, it's a 3-step hop, and we talk about them as first order, second order, and third order neurons. So the first order neuron is the weirdo, right? This is the one that actually has the receptor that's detecting whatever stimulus it is, be it pain or temperature or touch, and whose cell body is living in a ganglion, either the dorsal root ganglion or the trigeminal ganglion or some other ones. And then that is going to synapse with your second order neuron. So here's the soma of your second order neuron. And your second order neuron is going to live either in the spinal cord or the brainstem. And then it's going to synapse with your third order neuron here, which is in the thalamus. So that third one is in the thalamus, and then we're going to project to the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex. So here we are in the parietal lobe, in the somatosensory cortex. And what's really interesting about this is kind of similar for how the occipital cortex was arranged in terms of what part of your visual field, all those things were next to each other. Your auditory cortex was arranged in terms of, it was tonotopically organized in that, similar notes were next to each other, similar pitches were next to each other. These brain areas are arranged too. I love it. Everything has a place. It's all organized. It just, I want them to organize my pantry. Oh, but it is my nervous system. So yeah, okay. But anyway, so when we look at the parietal lobe and when we look at that somatosensory cortex, we can see, for example, that down here are the areas that are receiving data about the foot and the toes, and the genitals are down there too. So that one's kind of weird. But then we've got the knee and the hip, and then here we have the trunk and the neck and the head. And all of that isn't very big, right? Shoulder and arm is okay, elbow, forearm, but then look at the hand. The hand takes up a huge amount of our cortex because we get a lot of discrete, fine, high resolution data, sensory information that's coming from our hands. So we need a lot of brain area to process that. So you can see also that the face gets a huge chunk of the parietal cortex as well. So our hands and our faces, especially our lips and our mouth, get a lot of representation because they're getting a lot of axons that are coming into them. They've got a lot of information coming in. So here they've kind of drawn the different body parts as larger or smaller depending on what amount of area of the sensory cortex is taken up to process signals from that area. And this is the same type of thing, but represented as this like guy called the homunculus, right? So this is kind of saying if we were sized by how much sensory information our brain is receiving at each level, then that's what we would look like. So you can see the hands are disproportionately represented, the lips, the face, the tongue, whereas your forearm doesn't get very much. Okay. I mentioned the primary somatosensory cortex, so S1, which is in the parietal lobe, and it is located immediately posterior to the central gyrus right there. So it is this first bit of the parietal lobe. Sorry, that doesn't show up very well. And then you're going to have association areas. So again, the raw data is coming into your primary somatosensory area, and then that area of the brain has synapses with other areas in the parietal lobe as well as other parts of your brain so that it can interpret and make sense of the information that is coming in. So it's like when you, maybe at Halloween, you did that thing where you like are blindfolded and they have you put your hand in a bowl and they say, this is filled with eyeballs, and it's really just peeled grapes or something, right? So taking that raw data and trying to make sense of it. So in summary, for the somatosensory system as a whole, we have the structure, of the sensory neuron is that you have a receptor at one end, and then the axon starts, and then you have the soma or the cell body living in a ganglion somewhere, and then the axon continues and goes into the central nervous system. We've got dermatomes, which tell us what spinal level those axons are going to be entering the spinal cord at, and therefore what level the cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglia. And we also have different types of sensory neurons for different sensations, and they're going to have different types of axons, everything from really fast axons to relatively slow axons. It's a three-step hop. So we're going to have our first order neuron, which is the actual sensory receptor cell. Then we have a second order neuron, which is going to be either in the spinal cord or the brainstem. And then our third order neuron is going to be in the thalamus, which will then send the information out to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And that somatosensory cortex is somatotopic. So soma, body, totopic, arranged by, so it's arranged by body area, as you saw. And as you also saw, some areas get a lot more space than others because there's a lot more information coming in. So once that information comes into the primary somatosensory area, we're going to synapse and check in with those association areas so that we can make sense of and interpret the information. So those are our general concepts. We'll start next with touch or cutaneous mechanoreceptors.